I up until 2 weeks ago was the co-executive director of House Our Neighbors, but I have been appointed as the interim chief executive officer of the social housing developer here in Seattle. So um, I grew up very low income, was very housing insecure in undergraduate, and have been fighting for housing justice, social housing, non-commodified housing for a couple of years now. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to turn it over to Alan and Ty to introduce yourselves, and then we'll jump on into the presentation. So, Alan or Ty, who wants to go next?
I'll go. Hello, my name is Alan Francis. I use he, him pronouns. Thank you for having us all here. I've been a volunteer with House Our Neighbors for about a year and a half, I think. I have lived experience with homelessness, what they what they call as chronically homeless. I am now in public housing. I've been in public housing for about a year, and so glad to be here. Passing on the tie.
Thanks, Alan. My name is Ty Reed. I co-founded House Our Neighbors when it was a coalition of people before it was officially a nonprofit with Tiffany like 4 or 5 years ago. And I'm also really excited to be here.
All right, so just jumping on over to, I do not see this slide. There we go. Thank you, Kathy. We are going to give you a presentation like of a bird's eye view of the U.S. housing system. Um, it is There's a lot to cover, but just know like we will try to guide you along with it, and we will try to show you how a lot of the current interventions into the housing system, how they are not set up to provide housing as a human right or as a public good or something that is going to actually address the housing crisis at scale. But to start, if we can go to the next slide, Alan will go over the agenda.
Okay, so the agenda, we're going to start with our presentation. Next, the U.S. housing crisis at a glance, the current U.S. housing landscape, responses to private sector domination of housing industry, and social and non-market housing. Next slide, please. Oh, excuse me. Candidate organizing and Q&A.
So going into who we are, like Ty mentioned, her and I co-founded House Our Neighbors as a coalition in 2021 in response to the image that you see on the left hand of your screen. There were big businesses in the city of Seattle, the Chamber of Commerce, the Downtown Seattle Association, incredibly wealthy real estate developers that put forward a charter amendment that they said would have solved homelessness and done all of these really great things, but when you read the charter, it actually would have also enshrined encampment sweeps, the forced removal of our unhoused neighbors from point A to point B with nowhere to go in our city's constitution. And Ty and I met through Twitter and the phone before Twitter was what it is today, and decided to start a coalition to fight against and advocate against this charter amendment that we could not stand to pass. We were successful in a multi-pronged effort to get that actually removed from the ballots. It exceeded the scope of what ballot initiatives can do. I don't know if everyone in the cohort lives in an area that even has the ability to do ballot initiatives, but know that our story is really rooted in the power of a ballot initiative. So after the charter amendment, Ty and I wanted to go on the offensive. We had met a lot of really rad people through organizing against the charter amendment. We wanted to go out forward with something that we thought would have actually fundamentally addressed the housing crisis at scale. And that is where the initiative in the middle, that is the logo from our campaign, that created a social housing developer, which is required to own, maintain, and operate social housing, so housing as a public good in the public arena forever. We couldn't fund that initiative, so we ran this last ballot initiative that just passed in February of 2025, which funded the social housing developer by passing an excess compensation payroll tax on employers in the Seattle area. So we have a lot of wins under our belt, successes, and we've met incredible people like Alan and others along the way that have contributed and continued to contribute to our success. So that's a little bit of who we are. And I'm going to pass it back over to Alan for the next slide.
Okay, folks, and as we're going through this presentation, if y'all would like to interact in the chat, we would highly encourage that. So the housing crisis at a glance. In Seattle, the monthly median rent for a one-bedroom apartment and utilities is $1,717. The U.S. median is $1,146. 44% of renters are rent, and what that means is they pay greater than 30% of their income on rent. And to afford all that, um, someone would have to work 64 hours a week at a minimum wage job. High housing costs hit seniors and people with disabilities the hardest uh, be, because uh, because many rely on fixed incomes that don't rise with the rent. Seattle's prices are much higher than monthly income that people get from Social Security, uh, SSI, SSDI. So those benefits don't even come close to covering the costs. Older and disabled residents often can't afford essentials like food, medication, transportation, or caregiving. This leads to a chain reaction: skipped medical care, worsening health, isolation, displacement, long waits for subsidized units, and an increased risk of homelessness or institutionalization. Next slide, please.
Sweet. So this is where I jump in. Uh, Perfect. Exactly where we want to be. So how did we get here? This presentation will kind of go over like how did the United States, but also kind of Seattle specifically, get to be where they are in terms of like housing costs and unaffordability. So what I'll talk about first, but I'll go over all four, is 100 years of exclusionary housing policies through zoning restrictions, and an over-reliance on the private market to address our housing crisis. This includes like nonprofit solutions; those are still private market solutions that have been over-relied upon to fix things that are much wider than the scope of what a nonprofit can do. Defunding, limiting, and privatizing affordable and public housing. We'll talk about this in future slides, but if you're at all familiar with the housing landscape in the United States, you know that there was a point in time where we did kind of, in some effort to fight the war, like a war on poverty, fund a lot of public housing, and we've kind of walked that back, and we'll talk about that as well. And then finally, in general, housing as a commodity, as something that can be bought and sold, that can be speculated on, is prevents everyone from accessing it, right? This has particularly been targeted towards minorities and the working class, being able to deny this ability to build wealth when they are allowed to buy homes in only places where housing can be built. So the next slide, we'll talk about exclusionary zoning. Well, zoning in general. Just like very basically, in some ways, zoning is just kind of like a neutral act, right? It's just municipalities deciding where pieces of like what you can build on pieces of land, right? From an urban planning perspective, it is pretty simple, but zoning actually comes from a history of like racial segregation. Um, so the types of like what zoning does is it creates these different areas where you can only build certain things. When we talk about exclusionary zoning, we're talking about areas where only one thing can be built, especially if you're not in the United States. And in other places in the United States, just particularly not Seattle, you do find that there are like mixed use zoning areas where you can actually have like businesses, but also residential. So common types that you hear about zoning are just like single family homes, multifamily, that's residential. But you also have like industrial and commercial. And then zoning also relates to parking requirements. So sometimes cities have parking minimums, meaning that every time you put up an apartment, you have to yeah, you have to have a certain amount of parking spots. And then things like density and height. You'll notice in cities that there are particular heights of all the buildings in certain areas, and also like how many units you can have, which refers to the density.
Did someone have a question, or were we just flagging maybe pace of speaking?
Oh, I was just flagging if you all can slow down just a little bit for interpretation, that would be awesome. Thank you, though. This information is
Absolutely.
amazing.
I'm so bad at speaking too quickly, so I figured that's what that was. I will try to slow down, especially because I have like annoyingly the most dense things to go over. So also before we go to the next slide, I just want to point out that this zoning map to the right, I guess is what I'm seeing, is of Seattle. So when I refer to those different types of buildings that are allowed to be built in each area, you kind of see that referenced here from industrial, which is along our waterways. We love that. To like the waterfront properties, which are usually single family homes, to arterials, where you see a lot of multifamily apartments. Is that pacing a little bit better?
Yes, thank you,
Okay,
Ty.
fantastic. I'm struggling, but I can do it. Next slide. So zoning is like so much of the laws, because you know zoning is just a set of ordinances. It is not neutral, and it is not without its ties to enslavement and racial segregation in this country. So zoning as racial exclusion showed up in a few different ways. So if you're familiar with like restrictive covenants, basically before it was illegal to discriminate outright, you could just zone a city for certain races, and certain like white people could be in a certain area and black people could be in a certain area, and that was like pretty legal to do. In 1917, that was kind of overruled, and so people took these existing racial agreements where everybody, you know, kind of agrees to stay in specific areas, and loan companies rent out to specific races in each area. There kind of had to be a systematic replacement of that tool to enforce racial segregation without it being outright. So then you get things like redlining, where government agencies, which I don't want to say homeowners loan corporation, but whatever. A government agency basically created redlining maps for a bunch of cities across the United States, kind of grading neighborhoods on how risky the loan is. So that seems very neutral. It feels like a loan policy. It feels disconnected from race, but in reality, when people talk about mortgage security or how safe a mortgage is, you're talking you're basically kind of using racial dog whistles. So that's how a lot of cities got redlined. The maps that you see on this page, I chose Seattle is really famous because our voting maps and our current zoning maps still match redlining maps. So we're very impressive for that. We have a strong, long history of racial segregation, but it also included a map of Spokane. I want to say the Seattle map, oh, is the 1920s. I forget the year. And the Spokane map is around the same time, maybe later. Do not quote me on the year. But you kind of see how the green and blue areas, waterfront properties, nice areas are single family homes, and that's where like white folks lived, and dust next to industrial areas, less desirable areas. That's where like black and brown and minority ethnic minorities were kind of relegated to. And then finally, before we move on to the next slide, we talk about single family exclusionary zoning. So these zoning policies were explicitly meant to protect certain residential neighborhoods from the spread of industrialization, which really just meant the growth in immigration that was happening in a lot of American cities around this time. And so as time has gone on, and we'll have a slide that talks about like a kind of a quick timeline, laws and zoning have been used more and more to kind of reinforce racialized zoning to make it more about like density, protecting character, neighborhood character, and property values. Those are kind of been used as dog whistles for what exclusionary zoning actually is. Next slide. You can read this entire quote, but I won't. The picture on the left side that says, "Would you like this condition next to your home? 8 cottages on one 60-foot lot. Zoning would prevent this." These are kind of like indicative of the dog whistles in the 1920s. This picture is from 1922, according to Google, I believe. Don't quote me on that. So it kind of shows you that in the 5 years after racial segregation, explicit racial segregation in housing was outlawed, people immediately moved to, isn't this unsightly? Isn't this something you wouldn't like in your neighborhood? And other like phrases that I think like NIMBYs, not in my backyard type people, would kind of say today, where it's less about, oh, we don't want black and brown people here, but more about like, you're ruining the neighborhood character. The quote I pulled from this that I feel like is the most important, that kind of embodies the language shift from being outright racist to talking about neighborhood character. It says the apartment house is a mere parasite constructed in order to take advantage of the open spaces and attractive surroundings created by the residential character of the district. So calling an apartment house a parasite feels like very racially coded, and you can kind of see that how that impacts the way that people talk about zoning in the 1920s. Next slide. I love the angry faces. This is all bad stuff, you guys. So here's that history that I want to speak to Seattle specifically because that's where I'm from. Not from, that's where I live and have lived for a while. And also I feel like has epitomized American zoning laws. If you look into your city, maybe if you live in a small city, it's not quite the same, but every major city has pretty much gone through this kind of stage of moving out of racial segregation to using zoning to kind of reinforce that. So by the 19 and before the 1923 1920s, there were multifamily buildings allowed pretty anywhere. Black and brown people were still segregated, but we didn't necessarily tie those populations, working class people, to housing type, and so there was no zoning, and they were kind of wherever. After that, you see that single family zoning is introduced, and we start segregating neighborhoods into the only like nicer places where we only build housing, like single family homes, and the more industrialized locations where like working class white people, but also ethnic minorities stayed. In 1947, and when I was looking into this, like laws are never created in isolation, just like all the eruptions of zoning law wasn't just out of nowhere. It was in response to a court case. In 1947, a few things happened, which is the introduction, it was a few years after the introduction of the GI Bill. So that meant that a lot of white veterans came home and had their housing subsidized. And then it was 1 year after the end of Japanese internment. So Seattle specifically and other cities used this moment in time to carve out other areas to zone to be able to basically absorb more populations. So you do see an increase in the creation of like duplexes and multifamily areas. But I will say some of those kind of replace the bigger tenements that we used to see. And then 1950s and beyond, you see that Seattle creates its first comp plan, which I won't get into, but is also how Seattle kind of determines what the zoning looks like in more of a modern framework. You see a lot more areas that had apartments that had multifamily designations being downzoned to single family. So more and more neighborhoods not really able to absorb multifamily people, like multifamily groups who are more likely to be immigrant, black and brown people, and working class whites. And you see that happening after Brown versus Board banned segregation. So another legal response to kind of course correct after the end of legal racial segregation in the United States.
Okay, now we'll get into the current U.S. housing landscape. Next slide, please. All right. So existing mechanisms for affordable housing. There's public housing, which is just traditional public housing, and there's Hope Six. And then there's nonprofit housing, which includes low-income housing tax credits and local and state funding. Uh, and then there's uh, and then there's private, which is for profit, and they usually have incentive programs to hopefully make it financially worthwhile for private owners to help make it more affordable. Um, Includes penalty policies for landlords or developers who break housing laws or ignore affordability requirements, and housing choice voucher program so that renters have more options and they aren't limited to public housing. Okay, next slide. Okay, public housing in the US. Okay, overview. Operated under city and county-based housing authorities. Typically, it's reserved for uh, people who are at 30% AMI and below. And some of the issues largely defunded in the 1970s and 80s through neoliberal policy reforms, declining stock, thanks in part to the Fair Wealth Amendment, and declining quality. And I'll hand it over to Tiffany.
Thank you, Alan. And please, yeah, just jump through these uh, nice, slow entering in of, of sentences. So yeah, just as Alan was saying, like there are three main ways that we provide affordable housing in this country. And so we're going to go into each of the buckets. So if you think of them as columns, the first column is public housing, which is what we're talking about now. And then we'll talk about nonprofit housing. And then we'll talk about the ways that we incentivize affordable housing development through the private market. And then we'll get into some alternatives. But just so everyone knows, if we're looking at a bird's eye view of how we provide affordable housing in this country, that's what we're getting into right now. So in public housing, so if you have we have Seattle Housing Authority here. There's King County Housing Authority. I believe Spokane has a housing authority. Boise, I would imagine, just based on the size, has a housing authority, but these are federally recognized institutions that are chartered through the Federal Housing and Urban Development Department. And as Alan said, they were defunded really, and they were set up to fail through the 70s and 80s with Nixon and Reagan. One way that the Obama administration tried to revitalize our public housing stock was through something called Hope 6. This was a way to push forward urban renewal because because public housing was underfunded, defunded. It was set to not have maintenance and operations. This was a housing stock that really needed to be completely torn down and rebuilt, as opposed to if we just invested in this public housing stock, it could have stayed as high quality housing. So this was an attempt to try to get these units, these housing units back for the public. So this was a way for us to revitalize these neighborhoods, make some investments. And while it has been really touted as this miraculous public-private partnership, it's really hard for us to talk so much about the benefits. Like people being housed is a benefit. But what Hope 6 did overall was the federal government allowed for public land and public assets to be sold to the private market to hold forever, and then to build mixed income communities on those lots that used to be completely for public housing purposes. So in Seattle, for instance, we have three really notorious Hope 6 projects in the city. And if you go to those parcels of land, not only do you now see incredible wealth extraction from private developers, but you see the difference between what is the public housing versus what is the private market housing. There's difference in quality. All of the residents that are lower income live in this building, and then all of the residents that are not lower income live in this building. So this idea of a mixed income community is true. You live next door to one another, but you are still segregated based on your building. So instead of the public just wanting to invest, like I said, in public housing stock, providing housing as a public good, we decided to privatize it and use that profit to then reinvest in housing that we've disinvested in for a long time. Next slide, please. Now I'm going to jump into that second column of the way that we provide affordable housing in this country, which most of us are probably really familiar with, is through our nonprofit sector. And as Ty alluded to earlier, there are a lot of nonprofits are really well-meaning, they're mission-oriented, they're culturally aligned, but they are still at the end of the day a private entity that still needs to, have board approval and still at the end of the day needs to make sure that its books are balanced and whatnot. But nonprofit housing, we have a really robust nonprofit housing sector here that provides a lot of housing to Seattleites and King County wide, and I'm sure in your communities as well. Um, these are not as income restricted as the public housing. This sort of housing goes up to people who are making around 60% of the area median income. So folks that are baristas, service workers, I'm sure that would be different based on your locality, what that income mix would be. But instead of just having this money funding this housing coming directly from the federal government, there's a mix of different funders that provide the financing to build these units. A lot of it comes from private philanthropy. A lot of it comes from something called the Low Income Housing Tax Credit, or LIHTC in industry speak, and or local and state revenue. We are lucky to live in King County where not only do we have a local housing levy, but we also have a state housing trust fund that might not be the same in each jurisdiction. So while we still say, like at House Our Neighbors, we are over reliant on the federal government, some of the areas that you all live in might even be more so reliant. You might not have a housing levy like we do here in Seattle. And while nonprofit housing provides really important,
Wait, Tiffany.
mhm.
Sorry, I had to say it. They also want you to slow down a bit.
Thank you.
I'm
Like,
just so
nope,
entranced by this lecture right now. But
no.
yes,
Just give me a wave. Just give me a like this. That's cool. Yeah, give me a yeah. Uh, what we need to also like always reflect on like the pros and cons of anything. That's just important in housing justice. And what we have to bring up about nonprofit housing is that it is reliant on the federal government, and the federal government is a hot mess right now. It is relying on the benevolence of large corporations, which, if they just paid different amount of taxes, maybe we wouldn't need to rely on that benevolence. And then if we go to maybe the next slide on this one, um, I'll get into it here with the low-income housing tax credit. It's also just not affordable forever. But jumping into one of the main ways that we provide nonprofit housing finance is the low-income housing tax credit. So this is a tax credit. So nonprofits secure these tax credits, then they have to go and sell them on the private market in order to exchange those in for money to build housing, which inherently is setting up a profit-making scheme even on our affordable housing dollars. Low-income housing tax credit units are only required to be affordable for those making below 60% of the area median income for 30 years. However, the IRS stops auditing those LIHTC buildings after 15 years. There are examples in the Seattle area of affordable housing providers selling units that should be affordable for 30 years, but because of financial issues, they've sold them earlier. So we're talking about massive public investment into something that then becomes a private property in the future. Next slide, please. Moving on to the third column of how we provide affordable housing in this country is privately owned affordable housing. Next slide. So as Alan said at the kind of the bird's eye view of how we provide this, there are two main ways that we try to incentivize the private market, which at the end of the day is responsible to its shareholders to make a profit for the shareholders. Like at the end of the day, that's it. Like a private developer is not going to be in existence long, or the CEO is not going to be there long unless they are turning a profit. So at the end of the day, one of our most basic fundamental human needs is we're trying to meet that need in a for-profit market. I'll let you decide how we think that's working out. But one of the ways that we try to incentivize private developers to provide affordable housing is through an incentive program. The Section 8 vouchers, housing choice vouchers, are one way that we do that. All of us have worked with unhoused neighbors, in-house our neighbors. We know that Section 8 is a golden ticket if you can find a private landlord that will accept your Section 8 voucher, which is not a given. But it is something that is a really critical tool when we do not have housing as a public good to allow people to be going in, thank you, sweetie, indoors. So this is, sorry, my kid is going to join, I guess, for a moment, but I'm going to keep chatting. So we have these, and this is a way that we incentivize private landlords to bring people inside. At the local level, we also have something in Seattle. This is actually statewide. It's called the multifamily tax exemption. This is a property tax break that we give to developers if they provide units in the building that are lower income. But it is still trying to incentivize, it's still public dollars going to a private developer to provide these units. So that's the incentive, that's the carrot in policy speak. The penalties, these are ways that we mandate affordable housing. And speaking specifically for a Seattle example, we have the mandatory housing affordability. And this requires developers in certain parts of the city, so not even citywide, certain parts of the city to require affordable units, or they can pay a fee in lieu. And I would imagine if you were to guess what these developers do, thank you, the vast majority of them pay a fee in lieu of actually providing units of affordable housing in their buildings. So that does go into a fund. That fund is utilized to provide affordable housing, but that fund is nowhere near the same as if buildings actually were mandated to provide that housing inside. And then, yes, some of the issues that are with these carrot and stick approach is that we're talking about, please, we're talking about very short time frames of affordability. All of the ways that we provide affordable housing that we've talked about thus far only have affordability for 12 years, 15 years, 30 years, maybe 50 years. We believe we should be providing housing that is affordable forever. People will always need housing that is affordable to them. And then, yes, go to the next slide, please. Yes, thank you. So Alan is going to give a recap of the summary. We've talked about some of the current gaps in our system. Then we'll go into a little bit of more like the hopeful aspect of what we're trying to do. Go ahead, Alan.
Okay. Uh, so current gaps in existing systems, affordable housing stock that is time limited. The Faircloth Amendment prevents increasing public housing stock. We rely on pumping public dollars into private mechanisms to incentivize affordable housing. Low-income housing can trap people in poverty. Lack of housing affordable to middle-income earners who aren't eligible for affordable housing and also can't afford the private market. Teachers, nurses, social workers. Also, there's an over-reliance on the federal government. Next slide, please.
All right, so now getting to a little bit more of the hopeful or ways that communities have banded together to fight back against a system that is not set up to provide housing as a public good, that is not set up to provide housing as a human right, that is not set up to provide affordable housing for a very long time. So we are obviously going to talk about social housing because that's what we try to advance here at House Our Neighbors, but we also want to honor and identify the other non-market housing types that have popped up over recent years, as well as talk about non or tenant organizing in different ways that tenants are trying to make sure that their living conditions are great. And yes, as I saw Naisheen put in the chat, something that we didn't jump into too much is we're actually prevented by the federal government to expand our public housing stock past 1990 levels because of this weird amendment called the Faircloth Amendment. So even if we lived in a world where Congress wanted to put a lot of money into public housing authorities would not be able to build more housing past the 1990 levels. So we have to create other non-market housing interventions. It's incumbent upon us. Next slide, please. All right, so how we define social housing. We recognize that based on not even just where you are in the United States, but where you are globally, there might be different definitions of social housing. But I want to be really clear about what we mean by social housing and what we took to voters twice. I mean, voters said, yes, we want to create social housing, and then, yes, we want to fund social housing. So when we talk about social housing, we mean three main things. One is this is housing that is owned by the public in perpetuity. These are not assets on a balance sheet that you go and sell to make a quick buck and then turn around and use them in something else. These are public assets that should be invested in forever and utilized forever. And we see other countries like Singapore and Vienna who have housing sectors like this. We do not have in this country predominantly any housing that is set to be public in perpetuity, except for the ones I'm about to get into now. The second way that we define social housing is it's permanently affordable. We are not here to make a profit for shareholders. We are not here to make a profit off of renters so that we can have enormous salaries or, I don't know, big vacations or whatever else private people do. We are here to provide housing up as public good and like have rent be based on the cost of the building, the loans, the construction, all the debt we have to pay, but it's a public asset. And then third, we don't believe that we should be segregating our our communities into what their income is or their race or any of these other dimensions. We should be creating communities where everyone lives in them, everyone contributes in our society. We should not be segregating based on income. That is different wholly than the vast majority of the way that we've provided housing and the way we talk about it thus far. And then, yeah, at the end of the day, this removes market speculation. This is a public asset. It is not, again, I know I'm saying that a lot, but it's just such a fundamental departure from what we do. And then it's also this idea, like Alan said, and I just really want to reiterate it, we really do trap people in poverty in this country. We talked with many folks while we were gathering signatures that are in MFTE buildings. I saw some chat about that, who forego raises. They said, I can't take this raise because I will lose my MFTE unit, and the gap in rent between my MFTE unit and what I would have to pay on the private market takes all of that raise. So I might as well just not take that raise and continue living in an apartment that is affordable to me right now. And this is just what we're baking in, like as a norm, and we shouldn't do that. Next slide.
How can you just say next slide?
All right, Alan, go ahead.
This is
Hi,
my
my
slide,
dear. Hi,
Tiffany.
my dear. Go ahead.
Exactly.
Love
I think
you.
Vera's got you confused. Okay, so other than social housing, which I'm predisposed to think is kind of like a really great alternative, there are like other things that other non-market alternative housing models that have attempted to and kind of disrupted our for-profit housing stock. I will also say that like a lot of these are like limited in scope and can only apply to certain folks. So, like, for example, buying into your own co-op, that's kind of hard if you have financial barriers, background barriers. But we like to go over those things because they're like very valid, and other cities and other groups have been working on that. If you're in Seattle, you're probably familiar with like Africatown Land Trust, which is like a CLT, and other co-ops that exist around the Seattle area, but also around the country. So the first thing I will go over are community land trusts. These are nonprofit organizations that are governed by a board of CLT residents, community residents, and public representatives that provide lasting community assets and shared equity home ownership opportunities for families and communities. So basically housing that is bought by a nonprofit, but there could be some shared equity with the residents who live there. Then you have co-ops, which are like often condos. And then like rather than, being a traditional tenant, you own shares in the cooperative of the entire building, and you have a lease on your own unit that lasts as long as you own the share. So you sell the shares back to the co-op once you're ready to leave. You also have TOPAs and COPAs. I really like the sound of that. Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, or Community Opportunity to Purchase. So a TOPA gives tenants the right to make the first offer on their building if the landlord decides to sell it. As you can imagine, that's probably a limited option for some people, given the fact that like apartments can be huge and they can be expensive, but can be a way for like smaller apartment buildings to be bought and owned by tenants. And then you have community opportunity to purchase act, which gives qualified nonprofits the right of first offer and or the right of first refusal to purchase certain properties offered for sale. So that's super helpful in addressing some of the concerns with the nonprofit inability to solve the whole housing crisis that Tiffany was talking about, was at least giving them the right of first offer on buildings that they can afford. And then finally, which is not necessarily a housing model, but tenants unions. Tenants unions are really rad. If there's a local tenant union near you, you should join it and organize with them. But a tenant union, also known as a renters union or tenants association, is a group of tenants that collectively organize to improve the conditions of their housing and mutually educate about their rights as renters. Sometimes tenant unions evolve into being co-ops if they can get together and buy the land, and tenants unions fought for the ability to have things like TOPA, where tenants have the opportunity to purchase a building first. Next slide.
Okay. Thank you again for having us. I'm super honored to be here, and we'd like to go into a Q&A. So if you folks have questions, I think the best way, if you want to raise your hand, raise your first small virtual hand or wave, we'll call on you.
I'm
Ellen.
gonna stop recording now, and then I'll go ahead and hand it back over to Diza.